The Ar15 dissected from muzzle to buttstock. That's what we're going to talk about. This series, this mini-series, like the Lonesome Dove on ARs on Gunfighter Life. I'm going to cut this down, break it down into smaller parts. There's a lot to America's rifle. There's so much variety. It can kind of be overwhelming. You can definitely get analysis by paralysis looking at ARs and different features. And do I need this? And is free float really important to me? And what is a muzzle brake anyway? Is it really going to make a difference? All that stuff. This is a series again, so hopefully you're subscribe, following already. But if not, make sure you are. That way you get all of these. Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns and gunfighting the right way with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am blessed to be your host. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I make no apologies for that. God has blessed me to be a professional gunfighter most of my adult life in many different ways. I won't put in the normal bio today. I'll stick to what's germane to the Ar-15, because that's going to play into today's episode. Marine Corps combat veteran, joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours, was also an urban warfare instructor under Mojave Viper. Also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Wes's in both were infantry, so a grunt. You might deduce some familiarity with the M16/AR-15 platform there. Also served as a sworn peace officer, a COP, the common vernacular, LAPD, worked regular assignments and more specialized assignments, worked with some three-letter government agencies on some of those assignments. Also been a private contractor for a three-letter government agency that I won't specify. Also was blessed to be the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters in a large metropolitan area here, CONUS, in the United States. So you might imagine from that, I've been blessed to have a lot of experience with the Ar-15 platform, and I'm going to try and be as diplomatic with this as I can while being honest. Now, this is part 3, so if you're not subscribed following the show, reach down, subscribe, follow, whatever vernacular is used on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, a review would be nice. This is part 3. We left off where the barrel meets the receivers. In keeping with that, let's talk about the upper receiver. I think a brief and probably omitting some, but hitting the big points of the upper receiver development. The OG, well, I guess the OG would be the AR-10, but when they went from the 308, because that was the original chambering, to the 5.56, the early slick-sided, no forward assist, carry handle, adjustable with a tool or a bullet tip, but not two big knobs that would come later, adjustable rear sight, simple carry handle, simple aperture rear sight, and honestly, I think a really, really good upper receiver. If you wonder why there's that big carry handle on there, initially to charge the weapon to put a round in the chamber, inside that carry handle, there was kind of a funky-looking shark fin or finger that you would reach inside the carry handle and rack it. That went away for the side charging handle, but that kind of big protuberance on the top of the gun remained. And I actually kind of like the carry handle, but unfortunately in the military and most other tactical places, they don't let you carry it by the carry handle. And I don't think you should do that in a tactical situation because muscle discipline. But there are admin times where you're moving a ton of ARs or M4s from M16s or M4s from a cage to a different cage or something like that, where you're literally admin carrying as many as you can carry. Let's say you were out doing something, a field exercise, and you've got all your ARs stacked in pyramids, which is a thing that you do. You stack them like in pyramids. One muzzle goes in the magwell for the different gun. A couple of them can go through the carry handle, and then you just stack them on from there. You can get a whole bunch of them in a pile. Well, if it starts raining and somebody needs to move them somewhere, got one guy on watch, he's moving them somewhere, getting them out of the rain or whatever, and he's got to carry, 10 at a time, it's nice to be able to use the carry handle. But generally, they don't let you do that. So the carry handle, although it kind of made sense, it never really got used, I think, the way that it was intended. Later, they would add those two big knobs on like the A2 that I'm talking about, so you could, in the field, adjust for windage and elevation. That's great for a target range, not so applicable in a combat environment, and this is from somebody that qualified expert in the Marine Corps with iron sights. But in a real world, lead's flying both ways. Probably not sitting there dialing dope and making a hasty sling. I never did that. I never saw that from anybody in actual combat. And you could actually mess it up by having it twisted or moved, during a long campaign. So I think not really a great idea there. Again, great for a known distance range, but that was kind of the second thing of that with the big adjustable rear sight. With two different apertures, you get your precision aperture and what's called like an O2, 0 to 200 aperture, or a nighttime aperture. Because if you've ever tried to look through a tiny peep in low light, it's less than stellar. But you got your flip up two different apertures. Obviously add a little bit of weight, a little bit of complexity to that. And that would be on your M or your M16A2. And then we started getting into the world of optics. By my second tour in Iraq, we went from an old beat up A2 to an A4, M16A4, which had a flat top upper. Whoa, coming into the 21st century hot. The flat top upper is really common today, probably by far the most common. And that lets you mount optics. Now, you can mount optics before the old goosenecks are not the worst thing in the world. They're not as ridiculous as they may appear. They work okay. So you could mount an optic on the carry handle, but if you're going to mass issue optics, it's one of the very, before they issued them to pretty much everybody, one of the very early users of the ACOG. It's a good advanced combat optical gun sight, ACOG. Definitely good, definitely a force multiplier. Good, rugged, robust optic. And the flat top for that with the 1913 rail, Picatinny rail, there might be a slight difference, but they're commonly referred to as that. It's a good mounting system. A lot of the flat top uppers will have that. If you have that, you probably want the F-Mark front sight if you have a fixed front sight. A lot of more modern ones don't even have like the front sight tower, but sticking with the... Oh, and another iteration that went from the original to the early adoption was the forward assist. I think the forward assist is ridiculous, unnecessary, extra complexity, and really serves no purpose other than just being there, making the gun less felt, less sleek, more likely to get caught on gear and things, and is not really useful for any kind of field malfunction, right? If you get a malfunction, you're going to tap roll rack or tap rack bang, whatever your cool acronym is, or you're going to get a double feed and remove the source of the magazine and rack, reinsert rack back on target. For your double feed. If you get a triple feed, just probably take cover and have somebody else cover your back. But in none of those cases do I want to be using the forward assist. If I have a round that doesn't want to go in the chamber, I probably don't want to force it into the chamber. Bad idea. For an admin load or something, okay, but I see no point to why that was ever added. I would get rid of it. Just the old one without the forward assist. Also, a big brass deflector. Honestly, I would get rid of that if I could too. Or at least make it a lot smaller. But anyway, a lot of modern upper receivers are going to be in this configuration of flat top. They're going to have a forward assist, and they're going to have that rail on top. You might get some slick, racy ones, but many will have the ejection port cover. I like an ejection port cover. Maybe it's the old school Marine in me, but ejection port cover closed. Magazine inserted, rounded, and chamber. Safety on, ejection port cover closed. I like keeping junk out of the action. Just going to the range and shooting and then taking it home, that's fine. But if you're actually out doing stuff in the field, that ejection port cover is nice to keep stuff out of the action. It's there for a reason. Unlike a lot of the other features, it doesn't add a lot of weight. Why not have the ejection port cover? I'm pretty much going to stick to direct impingement guns on this. It's already going to be a long enough series. Maybe another time I'll do a whole separate one on piston systems. But pretty much your gas tube, which we aforementioned, is going to run back into the top of the upper receiver. It's going to go into... Well, let's come back to that. We're going to go down to the lower receiver because it just makes sense to talk about the lower receiver after we talk about the upper receiver. You kind of got your standard mil-spec lower receiver. Take standard fire control group. There was for a time, Colt tried to do a thing, and I'm not real sure why, if they were mandated to during that whole assault weapons ban debacle or something. They had a slightly different lower receiver for their ARs, and they were one of the big manufacturers. You know, there was a time not that long ago where you didn't have 50 different AR-15 manufacturers, and I don't know if there's actually 50, but there's a lot of just the people that just make lowers and stuff. But there was a time when it was pretty much a couple of big names. You had Colt, you had Bushmaster, and Colt kind of had their own proprietary thing, what's called like a big pin or a large pin, and they did some other stuff so you couldn't put full auto parts in there. And again, I don't know if that was legislated by an outside third party government regulation or if they just decided to do that. Either way, that went away. You still may see some on some vintage guns, but for the most part, we've standardized on that mil-spec lower receiver. There are some different ones. There are like polymer only versions where everything is kind of one piece and you get a polymer lower receiver. But in general, it's pretty much going to be similar dimensions. Now, there is a forged and a casting. Forged is generally seen as a better receiver, a forged receiver, over a cast receiver. And that just has to do with how they form it. Do they pour it in a mold, or do they actually forge it out of one piece? Now, despite it being the actual firearm, the lower receiver is the actual serialized part that's considered a firearm. Everything else you could order online as of the time of this recording. The only part that's a firearm that you have to do the 4473 on is the lower. Ironically, that's a pretty low stress part and one of the least important parts of the gun, and one of the easier ones I think to manufacture. So if it's just a general go-to AR, I mean forged, cast, as long as it's a good one. Never heard of cast AR lowers. Maybe they're not as nice looking, but I've never heard of them like breaking or snapping. Again, it's a pretty low stress part. I have heard of some of the polymer ones. If it's just the same dimensions as a regular aluminum and it's polymer, maybe just save that for a plinking or a range toy AR. There are some more robust polymer designs that don't look like the regular lower. But in general, the standard is going to be a forged aluminum out of whatever the aircraft grade aluminum or whatever that is, and I'm not a metallurgist, but that's pretty much going to be your standard. There are some pretty common upgrades that you will see. You might see an additional screw hole in the back to kind of tension the upper and lower receivers. That's kind of a nice feature if you care about your gun not rattling around. You may see them skeletonized if you want them lighter. Sometimes I think that's done for mostly aesthetics. But it actually is weight saving, so if you're trying to like shave weight, if you're trying to like make the next lower weight class like in wrestling, consider that like the equivalent of starving yourself and running around with a trash bag. Maybe skeletonize and save some weight there. Not a big deal if it's a competition gun or something like that, but you have to think about ingress points for dirt and debris and mud and water and things like that. You may also see some that have an integrated or built-in finger guard on the lower. That's okay. The old mil-spec trigger guard, though, if you don't know, there's a reason there's like a push pin in the front of that you can push in with a bullet or something. It actually is supposed to swing down so that if you have mittens or really big gloves, you can just shove your whole hand in there and pull the trigger. If you're in a really, really cold environment, that's kind of a nice feature. So although they're not as aesthetically pleasing, that just straight little piece of aluminum, for practical gunfighting in really cold climates, they do serve a purpose. You'll also commonly see today setups for ambidextrous safeties. You may see different cutouts for running different ambidextrous magazine release. So if you want like an ambi mag release, you want an ambi bolt catch, bolt release lever, you want ambi safety. Sometimes those will have slightly different and maybe proprietary things in the lower receiver. But if you're talking about just a standard fire control group military spec, which is generally a horrible, horrible trigger pull, one of the first upgrades I think you should do to any gun is get a good, reliable, but much better trigger than a mil-spec trigger. Those suck. And again, as somebody that blessed to qualify expert with an iron-sighted gun in the Marine Corps, with that crappy 3-round burst, even worse than the civilian semi-auto mil-spec trigger, you can do a lot if you're a good rifleman with a bad trigger, but it's a lot better to have a good trigger. So that'd be one of the first upgrades I would do before I worried about free-floating a handguard or doing some kind of Gucci paint job or getting a super sick optic. I'd run it with iron sights with a good trigger before I'd run it with some fancy optic, and I've just crap fantastic mil-spec trigger. But if you're talking about standard fire control group, standard forged aluminum lower receiver, it's kind of hard to go from back to front in this little area. But let's go back up. The gas tube we talked about, that goes into a snorkel. Your gas key on your bolt carrier group. If it's a gunfighting gun, you probably want that staked. If you want just a just experimental gun and you want to do the screws and stuff like that, but there's a reason the military specifies like a staked in, so it's not going to come loose gas key in your bolt carrier group. Oh, and how in depth should we go on the bolt carrier group? Let's talk about the big part. The big bolt carrier. Actually, let's talk first about the bolt. The bolt, not the bolt carrier group. The bolt, the front, the part that locks into the locking lugs on that upper receiver. Right? We talked about M4 feed ramps or not M4 feed ramps in another episode, but that bolt that locks in there. This is a really important part. This is a high stress part. This is the part that houses your extractor. Of all the things, probably after you upgrade that trigger, you might want to think about the extractor. If it's not a good premium extractor already, I would get another extractor and I would put the old extractor in your pistol grip. Consider that a free. All the tactical tips are free that you hear on the regular episodes. They're not for the patrons only. Get an extra extractor and put it in your pistol grip, because that is a part that commonly breaks. But that holds that. Your extractor has the spring and the donut. It's a little bit of redundancy there. That is again a common failure point on high round count M16s, AR15s, AR variants. That extractor. There are different proprietary ones, but most of the common extractors are going to interchange. Get a good beefy extractor. This is not a place to cut corners. Get a really good extractor if your gun doesn't already have one. If it's known for like a Colt extractor or a BCM or really high-end extractor, then fine, you're probably good. I'd still get a cheap spare, so you have a spare or a really good spare, but this is not a place to cut corners. This is not a place to get on some website and find out what's the dirt cheapest extractor I can find. Get a good quality extractor. And again, that fits into your bolt. The bolt fitting in to that upper receiver obviously is really important for accuracy. Its concentricity, said that way better than I did in another episode. That lockup, that's important. That bolt is important. That bolt face is important. Right riding inside there is a firing pin. There's the mil-spec firing pin. Get a good firing pin. That's what hits the back of the primer. Probably pretty important. Now the big chunk of that bolt carrier. I have actually seen bolts, the part we just talked about, snap, and I've actually seen bolt carriers rupture. Don't get the dirt cheapest one you can get. And since the commonly referred to as direct impingement, but gas piston is probably more accurate, common operating system goes to the bathroom where it eats. It dumps that hot, nasty gas in the operating system. The mil-spec is kind of a phosphate coating. I'm not in love with that. It may be the most affordable, decent choice at the time, 40 or 50 years ago, but I think the even older version of a chrome-lined bolt carrier makes a lot more sense. I want that part slick, less friction, plus less prone to attract that nasty stuff. Any kind of good, hard, slick coating on the bolt carrier group, whether it's, and it has to be done well. You could get really bad chrome, you could get really bad nitride, but a good chrome, a good nitride, a good tin, titanium nitride, all kinds of fancy coatings, but I would prefer a really slick coating on a bolt carrier group if I could get it, all of the things being equal. Most bolt carrier groups, sadly, because most upper receivers have the forward assist, are going to have those little ratchets cut in. If you're going to run full auto, you need a full auto bolt carrier group. Those are kind of standard now anyway. But honestly, how many of us are running full auto in our civilian ARs? But just know that if you want to do that, you need a full auto bolt carrier group. Oh, also on the bolt, there's those little places for the gas rings. Make sure you have gas rings. Inspect those. Those are a wear-outable part like the extractor, so make sure they're in good working order. I've heard make sure they're not all lined up together. I've heard that and I've always done it. I don't know whether it would malfunction if they were all had the gap in the same place. The bolt cam pin, you generally don't see too many problems with the bolt cam pin. Make sure you have one. Make sure it's put in the right way so the firing pin actually goes in. Now, the firing pin retaining pin, that's a little tiny part. I don't know why they engineered that thing to be in there, why it's not captive, but just know that if you lose one of those, you can make another one out of a paper clip. Ask me how I know. You may want to spare one of those in your pistol grip. You may want a spare paper clip in your pistol grip, just in case. Am I forgetting anything? I guess I would say, just again, important, good extractor. Make sure you have a spring and a donut. Make sure your gas key is staked and or it's just machined out of one solid block. They do make those. That's probably even stronger, but the standard, just make sure it's staked. It's not just kind of on there, because it may not stay on there. Okay, I'm going to skip over magazines. I might do like stuff that gets added on to the rifle at the end. I'm going to skip over magazines for now. That could probably be its own episode. But commonly referred to as your lower parts kit. These will often come in a kit with all kinds of goodies in there. Little teeny rocket ships and little teeny baby springs. All kinds of really small parts. Generally, if you don't lose these when you install them, they don't generally give you problems. I've never really seen an issue with any of these really small springs as long as they were installed correctly to begin with. Not really a high stress part, but you're going to have things like your pins. Make sure, unless there's some reason otherwise, you have captive pins. That's kind of the standard. All your lower parts. Again, more and more now you're starting to see ambi safeties and ambi bolt catches, bolt release, magazine release. And you might want to look into that if you're looking for something proprietary. The fire control group. Again, your common one is kind of your mil spec one. It's garbage. It's not garbage in that it doesn't work. Like, it'll work. It will fire the gun. It's kind of like a Glock trigger. Yeah, it'll make the gun go off, but it's like dragging a piano down a dirt road. That's how I would consider that trigger experience. Although I would consider a military specification M16 Ar15 better than a Glock trigger because it's really heavy, but at least it's fairly crisp. But it's just bad. I would, again, one of the first things I might upgrade, that lower parts kit. Now, there's two big ways you can go in this. You're probably going to buy the lower parts kit anyway and just not use the trigger components. It's generally just cheaper that way and you get spare parts. You can get upgraded springs if you want to go really cheap. Like, there are upgraded springs that you can do, and that will make the trigger pull a little bit better. You could put in some very cheap springs if you're looking to save money, and if you know what you're doing, take a polishing stone or like jeweler's files and do some work and get a decent trigger with most of the factory components. There's also like drop-in different components like the sear and the hammer parts. You might get different, just those individual components, and assemble them and put them in. There's also where you drive out those two pins, the two small pins I'm talking about, and an entire drop-in trigger. I would lean this way. I would lean towards a really good name in the industry manufacturer of really good drop-in triggers. If you don't know what you're doing with stoning a trigger or something like that, just get a drop-in trigger module. They're so affordable now. Of all the things you're going to spend money on the AR, I think you can get, at the time of this recording, a decent trigger for under $100. Maybe more than that with shipping, but that's really not a lot of money for a giant upgrade in shootability. Like, again, you want to really take your AR to the next level before you put an optic on it. Even, I would say, put a better trigger in it. And if you unless you really know what you're doing as far as gunsmithing, just like where the barrel meets the upper receiver, this is a part where I would caution you to not go outside your wheelhouse. And if you don't know what you're doing, just get a drop-in trigger kit. You just got to push out pins. You should be able to do that. If you can't push out pins and put in a drop-in trigger kit, you probably shouldn't be running an AR. I'm just trying to be real with you. The entire drop-in trigger kit, that's pretty simple. You drive out two pins. Theoretically, you drop in the trigger kit, you put your pins back in. Sometimes they have screws as like an upgrade to the pins. Again, I don't think I've ever seen any problem with the small parts or a pin in the trigger control group coming out, fire control group coming out. But that upgraded trigger, that's really There's all kinds of different triggers. If you're asking me what I like, what's my gunfighting preference if I can get it, like when I was the commander of a tactical team and I could choose what trigger I wanted, I like a flat trigger and I like a single stage trigger, although a good two-stage trigger is really good too. I prefer a single stage, maybe because I'm a 1911 guy. If you're more of a Glock guy or a polymer striker fired guy, you may prefer a double stage, a two-stage anyway, a two-stage trigger. And basically the difference is you got a short take up, a wall, and then it stops, and then a clean break. A single stage is just where you just add pressure and it breaks. There's no like take up stage on a good single stage trigger. I prefer a single stage flat trigger. You may decide for any number of reasons. Oh, and if I'm doing real preferences, I like a single stage flat trigger with a big trigger shoe. So I put my finger in the same place every time. I like the flat trigger. I like the leverage of it. I like the geometry of it. That's me. You do you. If it's a fighting rifle, I like 3.5 pounds. I don't really like going any lighter than that, so that would be my preference. 3.5-ish pounds, which is far better than this whatever up to 8 pounds or more that you'll find in some mil-spec guns. Again, in the drop-in trigger kit. Then you're going to have your pistol grip. Another really cheap upgrade. I can't stand finger grooves. I know it's a petty small thing, but I really don't like them. I don't like them on handguns. I don't like them on Glocks. I don't like them on knives. I can't think of a single thing where I want a finger groove. I don't know who the general purpose hand mold was for the finger grooves, but it wasn't my hands. And it's pretty annoying when I go to run an AR and my finger is resting right directly on top of that big protuberance on the military standard pistol grip. Get a better pistol grip. Magpul makes some good affordable ones. A lot of companies, tons of aftermarket pistol grips. If your finger actually lines up on it and you want to run the military spec one, that's fine. But there's a lot of really good aftermarket pistol grips. And I would caution you, get one with a trap door on the bottom. Some kind of door, some kind of compartment for small parts. And if the small parts rattle around, throw some earplugs in there. Throw your extra extractor, your extra small springs, your extra firing pin retaining pin. If you have some kind of sight that takes a, let's say, T25 Torx bit, maybe put the extra Torx bit in there, throw a couple of earplugs in there so it doesn't rattle around and get you shot. And consider that your tactical tip of the day. If you like this podcast, consider supporting. Make sure you're following so that you get the next installment. Tactical verse of the day. Hopefully what you've been waiting for. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. What a comforting verse. If you do any boasting, boast in the Lord. If you have any kind of training and experience, you wouldn't have it if God didn't allow it. You wouldn't draw one breath if God didn't allow it. I'm thankful for the life God's given me, for the training and experience God has allowed me to live through. I survived those scenarios that you might imagine from my bio, not because I'm special, not because anything good in me, but because God had mercy on me and had a purpose for me. It's only by God's grace that I draw breath. And that's true for all of us, and I'm thankful for that. With that, I'm going to read that passage again, and we'll close out this episode. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God. But resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Thanks, men. Have a blessed day.